And for technical purposes, we just switch on our key members. So I mean the panel discussions, and just I will request for the all participants who are the listeners, just mute your microphone and also the video camera. But anyway, we are recording this program and we will put on into our YouTube channels as well as in also other social media. So yeah, so it's a good morning to good evenings. All you are in the different time zones, and it's very beautiful time for together from Ulaanbaatar to Chicago. So I mean, two side of the world, and but we are united to for one theme for protecting the nature, protecting the environment, and for the World Environment Day. So today we are going to talking about quite interesting topic. I mean, the challenges and opportunities in the environment protection movement. So the last couple of years, we are observing that different part of the world there are so many social movements are wrapped in, and so environmental activism is also a quite important political topics and also socio-economic topic, and it's also a hot topic even in the contemporary politics in many parts of the world, and somehow it's also very influential for the national politics as well. But now we are talking about in a different perspective and challenges what we are facing in these environmental movements, and I just given a short introductions for these the topic. Actually, the environmental movements in the different part of the world, they have different channels. I mean, when you're looking at the developing countries, so-called, the environment movements are based with the some of human rights or the winning some rights for protecting nature and also protecting their own rights. When we're especially talking about in Kenya and also in Amazon regions and also in India. So we see that the people, farmers or the local and indigenous people, indigenous society and community, they came forward to protect their rights and also protect their environment and nature. And other way around, we see and we observe that in other part of the world, so-called developed world, in early and 18th centuries and 19th centuries, so the environment movements come up with as kind of like the who people loving to the nature, but I mean turn into the different movement, and they are also taken into the very political background and in the political movements and fight for the protecting the nature and also protecting for the biodiversity and also the calling for the different environmental matters and factors. And now we observing in this 20th century, 21st centuries, the all environment movements come together for the one world voice. But anyway, and I giving this the floor, and I would like to introduce our specialists and experts from the different part of the world and different organizations, from the academics to the practitioners and as well as private institutions and stakeholders. So I will give the floor for our distinguished guest to introduce short who are you and where are you doing and what are you doing now. Thank you. Barry?
So I'm Barry Liner. I'm the Chief Technical Officer of the Water Environment Federation outside of Washington, D.C. in the U.S. WEF is a global organization, professional association with over 35,000 members worldwide. And we generally focus on wastewater and stormwater and general water resources management throughout the world.
Corina?
Corina.
Hi guys, my name is Sakura Kwame. I'm based in London, originally from the States, and a mess of other places, as I like to say. I'm based at the Royal Academy of Engineering, where I work on policy, a policy advisor working on sustainable living places, and that very much looks at infrastructure, planning, and housing. Outside of that, I've done quite a bit with Unleash as a facilitator, collaborating with a range of different partners around the world on topics like this. And last but not least, I am a jazz musician. So wherever there are creative, sort of artistic ways to engage and get collaborations and exchanges where they wouldn't otherwise occur, I always try to bring music. So yeah, that's me.
Great. Odbaatar?
Okay. Hello, my name is Odbaatar Enkhjargal. I am from Mongolia. I work in traditional physical geography in Mongolian Academy of Sciences. But right now, I am studying in Tianjin University in China for my PhD degree. My main research is physical geography, geomorphology. But now I am studying air pollution in Ulaanbaatar. It's the priority issue in Ulaanbaatar. Okay, that's me.
Thank you. So the Kevin?
Hi everyone, my name is Kevin Sofen. I was an unleashed talent this past year and had the fortune of learning from all these amazing other facilitators. I live in Chicago, but currently in Wisconsin actually. And with my day job, I work for a company called WS Darley and Company, 115-year-old company that serves the first responder and military markets. And I help commercialize different water purification solutions. In short, we take dirty water and turn it into clean water for different applications, portable and stationary type initiatives. And then I also started my own initiative called Wristsponsible, which helps raise money and awareness for different grassroots water initiatives. So we do a range of projects around the world. And most recently, our biggest focus is on addressing the lead water crisis within North America, particularly within Flint, Michigan.
Great. Samuel, are you there? Seems that Samuel is still not in our platform. Probably we could wait. But anyway, we will start with our the first round of the questions. Actually, so as I mentioned that there are a couple of trends and dynamics in world environmental movement. So I would like to ask from Barry. So we observing that, as I mentioned, that in different type of environmental movements in different part of the world, Asia and Africa and Latin America. So it's kind of like the social movement to fight for their rights and fight for the ethics and fight for their own, for example, like to win in their homelands and also protecting the nature as well as, for example, like if the government will take up their own all occupations as well and engineer rights. So then the people are come forward and fight against that. So, so how do you observe that development of these movements in this current situations, Barry?
So the the environmental movements, you know, it's a combination of social, of economic challenges. Kevin will talk about what we see in Flint, Michigan, and the rest of in North America and the United States. I've actually had the good fortune to do some work down in the Amazon and with an indigenous tribe in Peru. And they had one of their real challenges was outside people coming in to log illegally. And it's very difficult to police that because they're out in a very rural, in the middle of the jungle, right? And the real challenge is how to organize and lobby and advocate for a group of people that have a very large, many square kilometer area, huge area, but they live very sparsely. So the challenge is actually having that political voice to speak up to ensure the enforcement so that there's not the illegal logging and ruining their traditional hunting grounds and fishing grounds and that kind of thing. So from that perspective, providing a voice to that challenge, to those people, you know, that was one of the things where an outside group came in to help and help them create some kind of some support to get the government to stop stop the illegal logging and stop the creation of a road through their through a highway through their area. So it's a matter that was a social issue and an economic issue because these people were generally working on a non-cash economy, and so how do they to pay that? So that's where outside help can, you know, don't want to say we're from somewhere else and we're here to help and we're going to solve all your problems, but working with the community and basically helping put the community first and raise their voice could make a real difference.
Good, starting point of that. That's also Kevin, you as very mentioned. I mean, we are observing the type of different political dynamics in US, but also mixing with these new social dynamics, also in environmental factors. And how do you observe that the current movements in this environmental activism or social movements?
Yeah, as Barry alluded to, I think it's important to note that it's not one single thing that we can point our finger to. You have to have a historical lens. When you look at all this, there is so much around the world, from hundreds and thousands of years of development, of colonialization, of different growing inequalities over time based on political structures. But I think it's important to kind of look at North America, for example. Look at post World War II, where after 1940s, from 1940 to 1960, the United States was having incredible development and a lot of infrastructure growth and a lot of car building and a lot of things that were kind of big industrial movement. But then come around the 70s and 80s, that kind of stopped. But you had a lot of these cities that were being built for populations in the 40s and 50s, and now you're looking at 2020, and these populations have grown and different economic issues have happened, which have caused money to be pulled out and infrastructure to not be kind of focused on. And I think, as we know, building bridges, building roads, building stuff underground isn't necessarily like sexy to some, but that infrastructure underground is very important. And in Flint, Michigan, for example, the infrastructure underground was not redeveloped, and lead was considered like the best thing since sliced bread for moving water. But we find out that if not maintained properly, lead has a lot of terrible detrimental human impacts. We don't see many lead issues in white communities. Frankly, majority of the lead crisis is impacting people of color. And you got to ask yourself why. And part of that's because it has not been the priority to allocate budgets to reinvest in some of this infrastructure. And then on top of that, as you know, others and Barry and Corina, everyone can speak to this, of you see a lot of these industrial complexes of big battery manufacturers or big processing plants in these areas as well, where they're just discharging. And another big issue you see in America is PFAS. PFAS is something that is now starting to come to the forefront of a huge, terrible, forever contaminant that is disproportionately impacting people of color. And again, you ask yourself why. It's sort of been, well, regulations were low and we were able to dump it here, and now these people didn't necessarily have a voice, so we just did it. And now you saw this past weekend, America was literally burning all across, and you're like, why? And rest in peace, George Floyd. But you know, it wasn't just George Floyd was the tipping point. There's so many different things that cause this burning up of frustrations, and a lot of that is environmental and social injustice that has to do with access to water, access to basic civil services. And I don't have all the answers, and neither does everyone on this call. But it's important to have this historical lens to understand why, and important to have these kind of conversations to put in the forefront of everyone's mind that it's not just one thing. We need to address all these small things. And in my core belief is, how do we look at developing some grassroots solutions on a case-by-case basis to address these problems? Because we can't, it's not going to be a big macro, hey, government signs a bill and it's going to be fine. It's going to be a lot of small grassroots-led initiatives to hopefully help alleviate and move us forward on to a better and more prosperous future.
Yeah, by putting that in the Kevin argument, it's very local and grassroots level social movements, and now it's connecting to the all over the world. And what we observed the last couple of months, we saw that Friday for Earth, it's kind of like the youth movement, and especially in the school ages, the kids, they come out to fight against for what the governments are doing, especially in the European countries, but then it's growing all over the world. And I try to get kind of like your definitions, Corina. So could you please tell me about what are the dynamics of such environment movements like Friday for Earth, and how it's kind of could be kind of like a global combinations of these youth movements?
Absolutely. I guess if I think about the dynamics, I would say it's one thing that has been touched on, and in terms of youth involvement, I think these movements are very intergenerational, and they really have a long history of being so. So I wouldn't say I'm an expert on the Friends of the Earth movement by any stretch, but I think there's something to be said for youth involvement, but I think also from indigenous movements in particular, there is a very strong sense of ancestry, um, and what older generations can impart and can share. And so whether it's, I mean, there's a couple of examples that I've been engaging with a lot. And so prior to COVID-19, which seems like a decade, there was obviously the issue around the fires in Australia, and in California. And it was quite interesting to follow some of the discussions on within indigenous groups, about some of the inert knowledge of being able to identify risks, for potential fires, and understand, movement of, different fauna and flora, the change of, the biodiverse landscape over time that sort of precedes those fires. And actually the indigenous communities, I won't generalize all, but there has been quite a lot of discussion about what can be done. I think similarly, I'm very much based in Europe, but looking to collaborate with more American cities. And there's quite a lot of cities in the Southwest who are also engaging closely with indigenous groups and trying to not just understand their approaches, but I think really find ways where the grassroots sort of movements aren't seen as separate from the top-down policy work, which I think there is I'm not saying that does occur. I think both of those, approaches do have points where they overlap, but I think in the way the media portrays it, it very much puts any sort of dissent or demonstrators as if it runs counter to sort of policy gradual change. And I think if we look at the history of social movements shortly, I wouldn't necessarily environmental ones, there was usually a combination of some form, of that policy and protest rather than policy or protest. And I think it's not till there's a real tipping point that you are confronted with that binary. I think they're always there. So there is an element where you need to, I think we all need to think about that in a very critical way. I guess the other thing I was going to say, so it's the indigenous part, indigenous narratives and indigenous experience. There is the intergenerational part. I also think these issues are inherently, this is probably nothing new, inherently systems based. And it can feel really overwhelming to try to fix the whole system. But I think if we don't have a vision for what that system should look like, it's really difficult to identify how our different contributions can how would you say, can fit together. And I think that's where we tend to sort of fragment these different movements as if they're separate. But when you talk to people in them, they have peers and friends and family who work on different parts. So I think the human part of it shows us we can work systemically. It's just, if we don't have a vision for what that looks like, it's very challenging to build those links in a way that leads to action. So yeah, I think, I guess my last point is I think the environmental movement as a whole is a very powerful tool for helping to build coalitions. In light of what's happening this week, I think there's a lot of movements where different folks are sort of leading that change, and there's a question about who's speaking and what are those sort of platforms for that discussion. I think the environmental one is loaded with these identity discussions and social challenges. Yet at the same time, I think there is a rich opportunity that I don't think we're tapping into. So yeah, I think the intergenerational piece is one where I think we could do more of that. I think the indigenous voice, and I would use that in terms of folks who are from those parts of the world and folks who have been forced to move for different reasons. And then I do think this systemic view is one way we could do that. Yeah.
Excellent, Corina. So I think that's an interesting movement that to see, for example, like the climate change is now of the top topic of these environmental movements, because the theme of these environmental movements changing in time to time. And if you're looking at the 1980s, we're observing that the biodiversity was one of the key topic, and now it's turned into the climate change. So the themes, it's like the agenda settings, they are also in the the movements. Also, we observing that. And now I would like to get the Odbaatar and in Mongolia. So how do you observe in your country these social movements? It's growing, and how? What are the dynamics you observe in
Okay. Uh, thank you all. As for Mongolia, Mongolia is the coldest capital city in the world. Do you know all? Mongolians are using the stoves for as a heating system, heating devices. Okay, and Mongolia has only 3 million people only, and half of them is living in Ulaanbaatar city. On 1.5 million people are living in Ulaanbaatar city, but Ulaanbaatar city air pollution is listed in the top 5 most polluted city in the world. So this air pollution is the most hazardous environmental pollution for Mongolian peoples. Because as for PM 2.5, PM 2.5, World Health Organization's tolerance level is 25 microgram per meter cube. But in Ulaanbaatar, in wintertime, it reaches up to 1,100 microgram per meter cube. It means Mongolian air pollution is 44 times more than World Health Organization standard levels. So it's especially this air pollution is influencing on pregnant women and children aged under 5. These are the very dangerous influences. It creates respiratory disease and lung cancer. It's the most dangerous. So that's it.
So I'm getting with Odbaatar. So you observing the air pollution in the Ulaanbaatar city. It's kind of like the critical issues in Mongolia. So do you observe any social movements and people who gather to protest against this kind of like this air pollution? Or any social programs or any movements?
Yes.
Do you observe?
Yes, of course. Mongolians actively uses Facebook. Then many people are protesting against the air pollution in Ulaanbaatar city. There every cold season as a winter, they are complaining about air pollution. Also, there are some praises about air pollution. In winter time is the smoking season, and summertime is the dust season. This is the Ulaanbaatar city is complaining. Yes.
So now we see that how coordinate or the correlate with this climate change or the real nature problems and also social movements. And I try to get Samuel. Samuel is here. Hi, Samuel. So letting that great, Samuel. So you could introduce yourself first of all, and then I will come to your questions. Thank you, Samuel.
Thanks, and happy War Environment Day to everyone. It's exciting to see some familiar faces. Corina, Barry, Sisira, my own very good friend Kelvin, and everyone else on this call. Happy World Environment Day. It's exciting. My name is Samuei Kpartor. I'm currently a consultant with the World Bank, but I also work for the Water Youth Network as the Global Impact Lead and an HR focused person in the governance team. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Samuel, being with us. So I'm just trying to give in the first question to you. I mean, you have a good background with working with the two different stakeholders, government and as well as NGOs, and also with the local communities. Okay. So do you think this collaboration beyond the borders, I mean, we are observing that they are like already some of the local activists already fed up with the politicians. I mean, when they're coming into the international global arena, so they talk and having an agreement, but then a couple of months and someone going out of the agreements and treaties, and then the whole program is collapsed. So what we are observing that there is now new collaboration between, across the borders. These social environment activists or the scientists, they are going to be unite to protect the nature. So how do you think about, and is it the new trends in this new type of politics in the environmental movements?
Where I think well, I'm not like an expert in this field, but I think throughout our history across the world, there's always been an urge for people with like minds to come together, try to solve a critical problem, that sees humanity, at the verge of destruction. And the environment being a very, very and the most sensitive section of our livelihood, you know, hasn't been really looked well upon, over decades and over generations. So in individual countries who have not really done much to affect the climate as it is affecting now the environment, um, there's been local revolutions, young people getting serious about, environmental sustainability and climate action. They've been governments who've, pretended to be serious about, taking some of these actions seriously, but are instead attracted to the global support and supposedly financing that are going towards these efforts. So the relationship between government and private sector organizations and community institutions are that be very, very fluid, if I might say, especially looking at a case for Liberia. Um, we Liberia holds 40% of the total rainforest in sub-Saharan West Africa. But again, we import almost all of our timber products. Deforestation, deforestation right now in Liberia is at one of its highest peak. Coastal degradation is increasing on a daily basis. All the government see is they support young people to raise their voices, and then they use the young people's voices to get the Global Environmental Facility to provide funding for them to probably allocate for the construction of coastal breaks or coastal barriers, but instead they will redirect the fund to something, not very productive. So looking at, for example, institutions who are supposed to be the limelight for the world, putting out of the Paris Agreement, the Paris Comprehensive Agreement, was like a big blow, like a big shock to the fight against climate action. But we know in the not too distant future, the right thing will be done, and they will come back, they'll jump back the coalition and do the right thing. As for governments and transboundary corporations and people going out, on a global scale to build a radical coalition to really, advocate for environmental, improvement, for environmental sustainability, for environmental development. I think it's a very, very positive step in the right direction. And I think it shouldn't just be about us showing that we have the passion out there, or telling people we have the passion, attending big conferences and big meetings, because in the past decades this is all has happened. They've traveled the world, they've gone to beautiful cities, attended all these big meetings, signed these agreements, they've made the news, and nothing has changed, nothing has happened. So what is to tell us that these new coalitions that are springing out of frustration will yield the same results? They've always been the desire and the urge to do the right thing, but there's always been a delay, a consistent delay, which is not an excuse for us to give up now, but it's always been a delay in getting the right thing done in and through these global coalitions. But I think it's a good step in the right direction. Uh, uh, Kevin provided a very, very beautiful insight on what is happening in the US alongside Barry. And Corina also did provide a very, very wonderful insight as to, the culture, how our individual cultures, as well for us in Africa, might, affect, affect such movements, and how ancestry and history and tradition, interplays in some of the decisions that are to be taken. And so yeah, so I can stop there for now, unless you would like me to provide more clarity on a number of things.
Thank you, Samuel. That's really important insight that you observe in from the librarian perspective. And but then again, as you mentioned, that I try to get the insight from Kevin and Barry. So I mean, we're observing that also in the United States there are environment movements in many parts of the states, and they are going to unite because we already know that the high level political figures, I'm not mentioning the names, but high level political figures in United States central governments, so they are withdrawing international support for many international organizations, especially also environmental and also a health perspective as well. But anyway, so do you guys as the scientists as well as the civil society members, and how do you observe in your country this cooperation if beyond the borders, and is there is in such a coalitions in civil society,
Yes.
Kevin?
In fact, just sometime last year, prior to my not prior, but a few days after I returned from China, there was a coalition launched. It was a national youth climate change secretariat, fully supported by the Environmental Protection Agency, by the government, and with potential funding coming in from the World Bank to support policy-driven actions so that our governments can rectify international agreements that they signed that they failed to nationally rectify, and join hands with colleagues in other parts of the country and other countries in West Africa. For example, we have the Mano River Union, we have the ECOWAS, we have the AU. So trying to strengthen, the first thing is, for us in Africa here is to strengthen our cooperations amongst these regional and trans-regional bodies. And once we do that, we think, there is a very, very positive, optimism for there's a very good optimism for a global collaboration amongst our various regional bodies. And I think one thing that has just delayed us in the past has been the lack of political will that drives policy actions, that drives the different decision making, that to make this thing better for us. Because the politicians have the power, they have the money, they have the soldiers, they have everything. So they control the decisions. So we will protest, we'll campaign, we'll advocate, we'll do what we can. But when they sit at that level, making decisions on behalf of their countries, they need that sense of belongingness, that this is the right thing to do and we have to do it because this is the right thing to do, and not because we're going to benefit XYZ, but because our generations and generations to come, our children's grandchildren and great grandchildren are going to benefit from the decisions that we take today. So yes.
Yeah, I mean, the same question I will put into the Kevin as well. So Kevin, how do you describe this cooperation, collaboration across the borders to articulate the real issues into the politics?
Yeah, I guess I'll speak about it in as relevant in modern terms as possible, and just looking at the coronavirus, COVID-19, where this is something that has forever changed how we do everything. I'm one of those guys that works for a company where I would go to trade shows with 100,000 plus people. I would go to the supermarket. I did everything that someone living in North America would often do, of traveling and going to stores. But all these things were halted and now forever changed. And kind of thinking about this now, whereas looking around the world, hundreds of thousands, upwards of maybe a million people have perished and died, which is a terrible thing. But we know that viruses are going to continue to be a thing. It's something that happened. And so now it's a matter of the whole phrase, how do we not let a disaster like this go to waste? And what are things that we can do to actually now take action, and what do we learn from this? And I think the best thing about coronavirus is that, to me, it was a first worldwide unified global response towards something. And I always thought when I was growing up, I was like, what is going to be that thing that's going to wake up the world and be like, wow, climate change and is a big issue. I was like, maybe it's going to be aliens invading the earth. But you know what? It was actually coronavirus that pulled us together. And I think it's something now, how can we look at collaboratively working to address climate change as a global initiative? Unfortunately, climate change isn't super visible in many people's day-to-day. It is visible in the Maldives with rising sea levels, in Miami with rising sea levels. Rising sea level is one of the first things. So I think now it's sort of, how do we continue to visualize the direct impacts that climate change is happening, not just rising sea levels, but these other different things. And it does require these top level macro agreements, the Paris Accord, and those things are great. And it's unfortunate that we had decisions to pull back out of it, but that doesn't mean, and I think it always comes back to, what can every person on this call do? What can I do today? What can you do today? It sounds a little bit grandiose and maybe altruistic, but it's like, well, you can do the little things with your time by using less one-time plastics, by eating less red meat, of closing the fridge, understanding the energy-water nexus. All these little things at scale do make a difference. And it also makes a difference to support organizations that actually do stuff from a grassroots level. Because it's not going to be one organization or one concerted effort, but similar to this whole discussion around Black Lives Matter happening, we need to be talking about it every day. And there's no right or wrong answer, but if we just need action, and it's apparent, especially with looking at what happened with all things coronavirus, the status quo is not acceptable. And we can't just keep going on and expect the world to go back to what it was. And frankly, I think 2020 was a great year for us to now be like, okay, well, what can we do moving forward to not just sit back on our laurels and actually look to think, we're just a blip in time. What about all of your kids, your kids' kids, your kids' kids' kids? Like, I hope that they have a world that they can live on, and world resources that aren't meant to just use, but to work with. I think one last point that I'll bring up, I think people sometimes shame people for maybe even not doing enough, but I think it's important to know, just having this call right now, we're emitting carbon. We're all carbon emitters. So it's okay to emit carbon and do things that cause an impact in the environment, but you should always be thinking about, how can I do something to offset my action? Or how can I do something to be a little bit better today? And it's not going to happen in one day, but just little things, I think, are things that you should be considering as you're trying to be a better steward of the world.
Thanks, Kevin, from diving in that question. So I just put in this question to Barry and Corwin. And these questions is actually, so now we're observing that it's not these environmental movements in so-called developed world. It's not something like romantic. It's not fighting, not looking for beautiful nature. It's also fighting for real issues and encountering real environmental issue, degradation, so climate change issues and sea level risings and environment pollution. So such a long list of the issues we are observing all over the world. So what type of internal issues you observe in these social movements, environmental movements? So there's no such international body to organize these individuals social or environmental movements, but to be united, fight against such a long list of environmental issues, what kind of challenges they are facing, these so-called disorganized environmental movements in different parts of the world? How do you analyze that?
Well, great question. When you talk about climate change, we all know this, and it bears repeating continually. The people who are affected most are the ones who don't have the voice. There's low-lying island nations that have already had to move the entire population off. The impacts are disproportionately to lower income countries and lower income neighborhoods, wherever we go. I think one of the real challenges is that, governmental organizations can lead, but oftentimes they follow what the population eventually is, and they're a lagging indicator. They're 20 years behind what the population, what the grassroots people are looking at. I think one of so those are the real challenges. The government is not, in many cases, especially where we're sitting right now, not necessarily leading in this area, but when you look at the private sector, in many cases understands that it's a false dichotomy between the environment and economic development. They realize, the private sector realizes that if you save water and protect the environment and do things better and waste minimization, you're actually saving money and increasing your bottom line and increasing your stock price. So they know that. The government's a little slower to come to that. And talking about, Kevin kind of mentioned it, but he's just not bragging about himself, but just what one person can do cross borders with what he's done with Wristsponsible, for example, getting sustainable and fair trade, bracelets, from, he can go into more detail. Yeah, exactly. So, and then he buys them, and then he resells them and takes the profit and puts it into water projects. So he's helping in the supply chain, and he's helping fair trade for some craftspeople, not in the U.S. And then he takes that money and then applies it for for water projects that not necessarily in the U.S. either. And that's just one person making a difference throughout the world. And it's kind of like the adage of how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. That's just those little bites and little steps that we go along. And people like Kevin, and then from Kevin to big companies who realize that it's a false dichotomy that environment and economics can't go together, and financial economics can't go together. And that's a perfect example of, at the smaller scale, of actually making a difference across borders, integrating the science, and the finance and everything else. And notice none of that had anything to do with the government. That's corporate sustainability reporting that's coming out of the private sector. That's grassroots nonprofits set up by just some guy in Chicago, right? And I fully applaud him for that, and everybody else who's doing that. I'll turn it over to Corina. So, thank you.
Yeah, Corina. Yeah. Yeah, what's Barry pointed out, it's also a very important point. And also, I try to illustrate that the same question, but in different way when you're looking at the finance and funding for these local, the environmental movements. And when you're talking about these financial problems and who funds these countries and who funding for these movements, there's quite huge criticisms coming from the governments in the developing world. They are quite they don't like to involve these environmental movements into their local politics, and they think, for example, Greenpeace. If you see the Greenpeace movement, Greenpeace activism, it's even in other developing worlds, and the government think, oh, they are against for our national policies, so we have to take away from these our old policies, old policy agendas as well. So they see that they are enemies of the country, enemies of the national interests. So do you think it's kind of like this kind of polarizations between these funding agencies and local government, the environmental movements and the national governments? How do you observe this issue?
It's really challenging to make any generalizations about all countries on this one. I've worked quite a lot in Colombia, and there was a lot of good examples at city and regional level where governance as a whole has been influenced by different streams, both top down and bottom up. But given the history, there were many times where the absence of the state meant that many different groups, but be it communities, I wouldn't say criminal gangs, but what's a good term? Basically groups that fill a vacuum when there is a need for governance and finance. But I think in the US, there's always, I would say, a lot of very strong story around the individual states, dating back to the early days of our history. So there's lots of examples where individual states have led a fight to, you know, for example, California has always been sort of a maverick on environmental policy. But where they're pitched against or in contrast to individual movements, I think it really boils down to, you know, following the dollar sign and who's paying and who's gaining. And if a group doesn't seem to be gaining from what is happening politically, there is a question of the status quo and how it was formed, why it's there now, and should it continue? I don't know. I guess for me, the thing I always come back to with the US and the UK is that as much as we are more capitalist nations, I would say since World War II, especially that 20-year period that Kevin was referring to, was characterized by so much government spending, and in a way that enabled the private sector to take the risks that it wanted to later. So whether it's in infrastructure is an obvious one, in the UK and the US, but research and development and, you know, financing what would later become Silicon Valley came out of a lot of government funds through the military to obviously develop our own sense of security. But that has enabled different risks to be taken later down the road. Similarly, in health, there's a lot of risk that would be, frankly, too high for even the largest risk takers to bite off without the government pushing that. So I think, I mean, I'll just invoke some of the work of Mariana Mazzucato, because she's done quite a lot on the entrepreneurial state and her understanding of how these states have been formed. The value of everything, and how, back to your question about financing, in some way it might not always be the government, but I think the regulatory regimes that govern how finance flows, regardless of whether, I think that depends a lot on how strong the state is, where is the rule of law, you know, how much can regulation actually be implemented and monitored and adhered to. All that being said, there is quite a lot of ways we can govern the way that finance is being done. I think some of the good examples are you're seeing in the wake of COVID-19, with countries like Denmark or France actually requiring, you know, commitments from companies, from sectors that want to be bailed out, to either, you know, especially from aviation, you know, either commit to more greener ways of greening their supply chain. Companies that do receive any form, any companies that have overseas tax holdings actually have to disclose them if they want to be bailed out. So I think this is one of the points Mazzucato makes a lot, is that the state has enabled a lot of this risk to take place, even if it's a 50-year, 100-year like investment. The fact that some countries are quite safe means it's very good for business to go there. Like, you're not going to invest in a place where, you know, the money that you invest could be gone tomorrow. And who actually bears that blame when it goes wrong? It's the government, typically. When we're criticizing responses for COVID, we're criticizing the government. We're not actually criticizing individual companies or individual people. So I think, as Kevin noted, like, COVID is kind of shaping and showing things cracks that have always been there. But I think particularly for how governments are, you know, let's say, showing more confidence, for better, for worse. There's lots of, you know, issues to unpack there, but I think there is a role that the state can play, either in financing, funding, or creating and enabling those regulatory systems to actually govern. And then I guess the big question is, what is the role of more international governance? We're in a time, I think, where, you know, public opinion and people's ability to critique what's going on around them can be amplified. So I think whether it's national democracies or international governance system, I think there's a real gap there. We're all experiencing COVID-19, but I can see, even if we observe sort of vaccine development, it is like a space race, and there is this goodwill and desire to be unified. But I think I'm seeing from country responses, we're doing what we can do at home, and we'll observe what's happening over there to the extent that it helps us understand what we should do better here at home. It doesn't answer your question at all, but I do think there is an element of the COVID-19 responses of governments, good practices, things we wouldn't do again, some things that we are also all learning as we go. Let's be honest. So yeah, that I think that's where I'll stop.
Yes, yes, Corina. I mean, this is a different type of the world now we're observing after COVID-19. So things are changing, and new collaboration, new cooperations, and an interlinkage between the different stakeholders. And this is quite interesting. But I'm turning to the Odbaatar, and I know that in Mongolia, so the government a couple of years ago, they're trying to deploy a project in Gobi Desert to divert the water to the Gobi Desert with the interest of multinational companies who are the mining industries, I mean, who mine in that area, and they are big multinational companies. But there were a couple of social movements and environmental movements who protest against this water diversion project. And how still currently these kind of social acts, how they are reacting such government policies? Do this environment movement afraid of the government, or do they cooperate with the Mongolian government?
In my opinion, the Mongolian government is taking care of people very well. So Mongolian peoples are very thanking to the government. Yes, they don't protest against the Mongolian government policy, because Mongolians, as for COVID-19, Mongolians are so few, very few cases are discovered in Mongolia. So Mongolians are so thankful to government. Then also, but private sector is also very difficult very difficult condition, because many private companies are not working, and so many people are unemployed. It's the bad thing. So there's some taking actions from by the Mongolian government. There is no bad direction. Okay.
Thank you, Odbaatar. But coming to the Samuel, and Samuel mentioned that regional cooperations we're observing, like the African region. So it's, I mean, there's always there is criticisms with the government actions in the some of part of the African countries because of the corruptions and also kind of like the hidden agenda with multinational companies when you're looking at the mining and also the land grabbing as well. So Samuel, could you please tell me and how this local engagement to protect their local resources, environmental resources?
Yeah, well, so with the emergence of regional bodies like the ECOWAS, the African Union, the Moderator Union, there's been there's been various policies that cross cuts across various countries and that affects, you know, the environmental governance of natural resources in various countries. So it's cross boundaries. And civil society organizations, private sector has been, have been very collaborative with government when it comes to sourcing out programs that helps to preserve the environment and allow communities to benefit, probably not by destroying the environment, but incentivizing the fact that if you don't want me to cut down my trees, how do I get timber, for example, or how do I feed my family? How do I get livelihood? So so the government with private sector and society institutions, grassroots organizations, communities have been working on a number of different programs that have been funded by international organizations to help preserve the environment. So there's been a lot of cooperation, especially right now. ECOWAS is moving towards single currency. African is moving towards one passport. So there are a lot of other agreements and policies that are, on the way that will pave the way for a more fluid cooperation amongst governments and community organizations, that had, because such relationship in the past has been very, very strained. You know, Africa currently is in a very, very fragile timeline because a number of key African countries are going to elections. You have elections you have elections in Ghana, elections in Liberia, elections in Guinea, elections in a number of countries in Africa. So due to the fragility of the time and due to COVID, there are a lot of constitutional issues even coming up. So the constitution is suspended, laws are violated, certain standing policies that are backed by constitution will not be followed. And so it again will make the relationship between governments and communities to be strained. But so far so good. Things are actually improving. They are not as they were in the past. Governments in Africa and in Liberia, for example, are becoming more and more responsive. And governments are listening to people more, knowing what their plights are. Before signing agreements, they're trying to see what aspects of the community's people's lives are affected, how their lives will be improved, and how the community is going to benefit, and how does it not destroy the environment. So a number of things are coming up. COVID, for example, is teaching us a new lesson. We're reaching a point where we are wrapping up. We'll soon be opening back the country. Things will be returning to normal back very soon. Yeah, and I'm sure you've heard this global international politics between Madagascar and WHO over the COVID organics, and people looking at the effectiveness of traditional herbal medicine. So a number of these different contexts are being interplayed in the overall relationship between governments and communities, respecting traditional and cultural beliefs, as well as admonishing communities that this is not something that has to do with traditional culture, but it has to do with the overall governance, safety, and state of the country. So relationships are improved between communities and government, and we hope that in a not too distant future they will get better and better. And like Barry and mentioned, sometimes the problem is not really leadership, and like as Kevin intimated, it's about every individual doing something to just make a difference. And you have different individuals in different parts of different communities, in different towns and cities, in different places around the world. Then you have a global coalition of individuals who are making amazing, contributions to to make the world a better place and improving lives one person at a time. It's about us as individuals. What can we do? How can we better these relationships? How can we look at what has gone wrong in the past and improve them in the future? And so that and create lessons learned so that our kids can learn from in the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Samuel. And this is the last round of questions because we are round up in our last minutes. And I just giving a general question to all our distinguished guests and experts. So with your expertise and your experiences, what would be the future of these environmental movements? They will be a part of these global agenda settings or policy implementations to protect the nature and environment? First of all, Barry.
So I'm not going to forecast what the specifics look like, but I will tell you that seeing the talents at Unleash, for example, seeing the young people that I get to work with. Obviously, I'm not one of them anymore with but that actually, I should be cynical in many ways in today's world. There's reasons to be cynical, but seeing the work that the talents at Unleash, the young people that I work with worldwide, I actually am optimistic about what they're going to accomplish, and I hope to be able to help them out for the next 20, 30 years myself. So I think it's going to be really positive from seeing the work from Kevin and Corina and everybody else, and Samuel and all the talents from Unleash as well.
Great, Corina.
I'm gonna echo Barry's point. I think predictions right now. This is more my whole idea of predictions right now. Could not have predicted this. So yeah, I guess a bit of humility that we're all not making it up as we go. So though it sometimes it feels like it. I think we're doing our best, and I think that's a cop out. I think our intentions are there. I think we have to be able to match our intentions with purpose and understanding, who's doing what. And I think that actually pulls us back to more humility about what we can achieve as a group. And I think communities have been even more, it's been so important during COVID to understand, for me, what community means, because in some ways we're not in most countries can't be with our communities in the ways we have before. So really trying to get back to what that means. And I think if we understand that at a very intrinsic human level, I think the future of not just those movements, but how our communities relate to one another it could be healthier. But I do also share sort of Barry's optimism that I think when I see young people, even younger than me, like teenagers, so excited and inspired and almost crazily empowered to a level that I'm in awe. And I think, I'm saddened in some ways that we're not where we would have liked to be. But I guess on the more optimistic side, I think because, young people, they don't sort of see those boundaries. And I mean, in that way. So I'm quite excited about that, and really trying to see how best to use, my skills and talents to actually bring that out of others. I think that's become more important to me now. Yeah.
Yeah, optimism is very important crossing the generations. So Kevin.
To both Corina and Barry's point, I think it's easy to be that guy that's always kind of a little pessimistic and kind of be, glass half empty. But you don't want to have that mindset. And if the world comes to an end and be like, oh yeah, I told you so. It's kind of have that. You got to have that spark. And I'm an altruistic belief that the world, as much as humans have done a lot of bad, I think they're humans doing amazing things for each other. And granted, as I said earlier, we are carbon emitters, but we can do things to offset that and work together to live as somewhat of a prosperous, harmonious earth. And I think it's easy again to kind of sit back and talk about all the things that are going on, and we should be talking, but you just need to do something, do anything. It's just a matter of being part of your local groups, being part of these kind of discussions, donating your time, donating money, doing little things with your actions. It's not impossible to make a positive ripple effect. And my challenge to anyone listening or to anyone thinking about starting this thing in my hand, not only as coronavirus changed the world, this has absolutely changed the world. You can run a business, you can pseudo run the world with your cell phone. In terms of right now, I know there's inequalities, and I experience white privilege because I was born into it, and I'm very fortunate with what I have. But I do believe those that have the ability to know have the duty to act, the quote that I live by. But I believe that today with the internet doesn't care who you are, what your background is, where you came from, whether you went to Harvard or whether you didn't get an education. It doesn't matter. If you're good enough, if you can bring the heat, bring the value, bring the passion, you can be successful and make a difference. And as Barry alluded to earlier, business and environment do not need to be mutually exclusive. You can have a successful business and do certain things to also promote environmental sustainability and environmental stewardship. So always be thinking about that in mind. Don't feel like you don't have the access to resources, because I can guarantee every person on the Zoom call would love nothing more than to talk to an aspiring entrepreneur, aspiring anyone, and yeah, just throw something against the wall and start running with it. And great talking with all of you.
Thank you, Kevin. As little drops make the river. So Odbaatar, so how do you observe the future of these environmental movements?
Okay. In my opinion, all people who living in the Earth is the understand we are all together living in the one Earth. So we after this COVID, we will together in harmony and much don't much protest against each other. Is my prediction. Yeah. Only we are living one Earth. This is the main understanding in this social movement. Okay.
Yeah, we have no planet B. We have only one planet. So we had protect to all and to together. Samuel, last wording for you.
Well, I don't really have much to add, but to see Barry, Corina, Kelvin, and I've said it all. But just one statement, and that the future is green. The future is green for us all. There's there are a lot of good things that will happen, and the people of the earth are very, very resilient people. We've been through so much in our, throughout, from generations to generations, millions of years ago. The world has been, humans have been through a lot, and we're not going to go down in history. We're not going down in history like that. We're going to fight, and we're going to win. That's all I can say. We're going to win.
Thank you, Samuel. This is really important and my last ending words. And I would like to hear thanks for hosting this event, Mrs. Banu, Miss Sanka, and also Miss Asita Munasinghe. Thank you for your support to having this such a nice platform and online discussions. And thank you guys and joining with from different part of the world, and it's amazing. And we will upload these discussions into our social media and soon, and then other people also could watch as a recorded discussions. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Nice one.
Goodbye. Happy
Kevin.
Environment Day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Till next time.